I'm the deputy chairman of the state of Illinois Black Panther Party, Fred Hampton. And a lot of people don't understand the Black Panther Party's relationship with white mother country radicals. A lot of people don't even understand that word that Elvis uses a lot. But what we're saying is that there are white people in the mother country that are for the same types of things that we are for stimulating revolution in the mother country. And we've said that we'll work with anybody and form coalition with anybody that has revolution on their mind. We're not a racist organization because we understand that racism is an excuse used for capitalism. And we know that racism is a byproduct of capitalism.
Intersectionality was first introduced by the amazing Kimberly Crenshaw.
Many years ago, I began to use the term intersectionality to deal with the fact that many of our social justice problems like racism and sexism are often overlapping, creating multiple levels of social injustice. Now, the experience that gave rise to intersectionality was my chance encounter with a woman named Emma DeGraffenreid. Emma DeGraffenreid was an African-American woman, a working wife, and a mother. I actually read about Emma's story from the pages of a legal opinion written by a judge who had dismissed Emma's claim of race and gender discrimination against a local car manufacturing plant. Emma, like so many African-American women, sought better employment for her family and for others. She wanted to create a better life for her children and for her family. But she applied for a job and she was not hired, and she believed that she was not hired because she was a black woman. Now, the judge in question dismissed Emma's suit. And the argument for dismissing the suit was that the employer did hire African Americans and the employer hired women. The real problem, though, that the judge was not willing to acknowledge was what Emma was actually trying to say. That the African Americans that were hired, usually for industrial jobs, maintenance jobs, were all men. And the women that were hired, usually for secretarial or front office work, were all white. Only if the court was able to see how these policies came together would he be able to see the double discrimination that Emma DeGraffenreid was facing. But the court refused to allow Emma to put two causes of action together to tell her story because he believed that by allowing her to do that, she would be able to have preferential treatment. She'd have an advantage by being able to have two swings at the bat when African-American men and white women only had one swing at the bat. But of course, neither African-American men or white women needed to combine a race and gender discrimination claim to tell the story of the discrimination they were experiencing. Rather than broadening the frame to include African-American women, the court simply tossed their case completely out of court. Now, as a student of anti-discrimination law, as a feminist, as an anti-racist, I was struck by this case. It felt to me like injustice squared. So first of all, black women weren't allowed to work at the plant. Second of all, the court doubled down on this exclusion by making it legally inconsequential. And to boot, there was no name for this problem. And we all know that where there's no name for a problem, you can't see a problem. And when you can't see a problem, you pretty much can't solve it. Many years later, I'd come to recognize that the problem that Emma was facing was a framing problem. The frame that the court was using to see gender discrimination or to see race discrimination was partial, and it was distorting. For me, the challenge that I faced was trying to figure out whether there was an alternative narrative, a prism that would allow us to see Emma's dilemma, a prism that would allow us to rescue her from the cracks in the law, that would allow judges to see her story. So it occurred to me, maybe a simple analogy to an intersection might allow judges to better see Emma's dilemma. So if we think about this intersection, the roads to the intersection would be the way that the workforce was structured by race and by gender. And then the traffic in those roads would be the hiring policies and the other practices that ran through those roads. Now, because Emma was both black and female, she was positioned precisely where those roads overlapped, experiencing the simultaneous impact of the company's gender and race traffic. The law was like that ambulance that shows up and is ready to treat Emma only if it can be shown that she was harmed on the race road or on the gender road, but not where those roads intersected. So, what do you call being impacted by multiple forces and then abandoned to fend for yourself? Intersectionality seemed to do it for me.
It comes from the idea that part of our personalities come from an intersection, hence the name, of multiple sources of identity groups, which can compound and intertwine or even cancel each other out in ways that can result in misunderstandings or blind spots or even be used intentionally for harm, meaning different people can experience the same situation but have totally different understandings of what and how it happened. Like the black woman example, where her race and gender identities were viewed as two separate issues, when in actuality they overlap or intersect as part of her identity and experience as a black woman. Intersectionality is most commonly understood in the perspective of oppression, and has been mischaracterized as the Oppression Olympics.
See, your opinion only matters relative to your identity, and where that identity ranks on the hierarchy of intersectionality. Today's activists demand blacks make common cause with other allegedly oppressed people. Blacks.
But this is not the case. Intersectionality is not about stacking up marginalizations and or privileges and seeing who ranks lower or higher, but it's actually kind of the opposite.
Blacks.
It's a lens through which we can view the interactions between people with shared and contrasting identities. And while it came from a goal of fighting oppression, it is actually a very nuanced philosophy of egalitarianism by understanding that everyone is infinitely unique and it would be impossible to take account of and tally for all of our differences, but that we also have so much more in common than we don't. And intersectionality provides a way for us to focus on empathy and what we do have in common, but without forgetting what makes us different, is the understanding that everyone is a unique individual whose personality is, at least partly, made up by an uncountable collection of intersecting identity groups, both voluntary and involuntary, chosen or given, permanent or temporary, or possibly even unknown to the individual. Examples are, of course, things like race and gender, but also things like height, whether you're short or tall, age, young or old, abled or disabled, in ways that are visible or even invisible. But also things like pilot or teacher, or even things like gamer or nerd. It can go on in basically any way. As I said, personalities are truly infinite. And as I also said, some may not even be chosen, but instead projected onto them by others, like foreigner or different. And through stereotypes, like what you think of when you hear things like, oh, that person plays sports, so they must be blah blah blah. Or that person is a farmer, or that person is from the city. An individual's personality or identity is made up of all these parts, but it is not who they are. They are just that, parts. Some may not even identify with some of the identity groups they are a part of, like children of immigrants, who identify more with their country of birth than the culture of their heritage, or vice versa. Or mixed-race people who may feel othered and like they don't fit in anywhere. You might have heard of the concept of code switching, which is when people change their speech and behavior around different groups of people, or in situations like hanging out with friends versus how you act at work or school. But it is most common in communities of color when interacting with white people or something like that. But it truly does apply to everybody. As I said, you're not the same person at work or school as you are at home and with your friends. But the point is, I'm not saying that we need to keep track of every single part of every person's identity. That is the misconception that I'm trying to address. The problem with identity politics, or so-called woke scolds, they care more about the identities than the individual. When you apply this logic incorrectly, you get things like, did Anne Frank have white privilege? Where just caring about the question means you lose. However, you can answer this question rather easily, because intersectionality applies something that identity politics does not, which is context. Anne Frank could not have had white privilege in Europe during World War II, because the Nazis, and many European cultures in general, simply did not consider Jews to be white, and whiteness is just made up anyway. She was, however, what many would consider to be called white passing, and if she somehow found herself in the Jim Crow South, she would still be able to use whites-only facilities like bathrooms and water fountains. But she would still deal with anti-Semitism and misogyny. But that's not the point. The point isn't whether she was quote-unquote white or not. The point is she's fucking Anne Frank. A human being who was forced to hide in an attic with her family and wrote a diary about it until they were found out and became victims of the Holocaust. Like, what the fuck, man? White privilege absolutely exists, but it is not relevant here. She also had walking and hearing privilege, but does anybody bring that up? No, because nobody actually gives a fuck about that, because the whole thing is just a psyop anyway to make leftists look like idiots. And this is why identity politics fails, where intersectionality does not. The point of intersectionality is to keep the human element and context in mind when we realize that everyone has these infinitely many identity groups that comprise their personality. When we do, we find we have much more in common than not, and it is much easier to identify with and find solidarity and empathy with people when you realize that. But there are still differences. Privileges and obstructions do exist. But just because someone has identities that may be marginalized or privileged, that isn't their entire personality. Many physically disabled people feel infantilized when too much focus is put on their disability in interpersonal scenarios, and they don't like to be pandered to or patronized when all they're doing is just living their lives like everyone else. But at the same time, they are physically disabled, and their disabilities should be accommodated as best as possible, and with as much dignity as possible. There is a gray area between completely ignoring identities like disability and race, and making identity the center of every single interaction. You just need to be cognizant of the intersecting identities of different people. There is a saying, don't talk about us without us, which means when it comes to discussing marginalized identities, the final say on how they deserve to be treated and how to best accommodate their identities is with the people of those identity groups. But that also doesn't mean that others not within their identity cannot help speak on their behalf. No, you shouldn't sit your white ass down and listen to everything Candace Owens or Kanye say, because a lot of what they say is very harmful to the black community and others as well, especially Jewish communities.
Every human being has something of value that they brought to the table. Especially Hitler.
People somehow think that Africans were living happily ever after and things were great, and then the horrible English, British descended upon and murdered everybody, and the French suddenly murdered everybody, and that just isn't the truth. Obviously, the African nations had slavery, just like the European nations had slavery. Wow. So it's an evil that was not started, did not begin in Europe, actually. It can actually be traced back to Muslim origins.
Especially Hitler.
And really, you shouldn't be listening to just one person on any topic anyway, because there are multitudes of people within every identity group, and many more that cross over because everyone has infinite. But you also shouldn't stand down just because you aren't a member of a specific identity group, or stop in your tracks just because someone throws their identity in your face, so they can shut you up and poison the well and make their bad faith grifter arguments, like Blair White or Candace Owens. Or maybe they're genuinely misinformed. In that case, you probably can't convince them, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't try to help, if you actually know what you're talking about, and can say it in a way that doesn't come across as speaking over them, especially from a point of privilege. It's important to listen, but it's just as important to think. This is why there's been so much support for Palestinian liberation, and why Zionists call this support anti-Semitic. This is where intersectionality comes in. No, it is not anti-Semitic to be anti-Zionist. You can be Jewish without being Zionist, just like the members of Jewish Voices for Peace. If ethnically Jewish people deserve a safe place to live, which they do, so do ethnic Palestinians, just like everyone else does. Before Israel was created in 1949, with the help of many European countries for their own benefit, there were plenty of other places it could have been established. And it is not anti-Semitic to say that. In fact, the true anti-Semitism is tying the concept of Zionism to Judaism. A government is not a people. Jewish people are not the state of Israel, and vice versa. Just like Palestinians are not Hamas, and vice versa. Just like Chinese people are not the CCP, and just like what makes a woman is not a functioning womb, and what makes a man is not his work. Those things can be a part of them, but they are not what make them them. The world is dying, folks. We need to work together. It's time to move past this liberal, meaningless identity politics, actual oppression Olympics bullshit, and replace it with true, progressive, unifying intersectionality. Everybody is unique, but we all have more in common than we don't. You don't need to keep everything in mind. You just need to understand that people have different experiences and listen to them, and you can parse out the truth. We can do this. Remember, intersectionality, not identity politics. The problem isn't wokeness, it's weaponized ignorance.
We said that we'll work with anybody and form coalition with anybody that has revolution on their mind. We're not a racist organization because we understand that racism is an excuse used for capitalism. And we know that racism is a byproduct of capitalism.